This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 262 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I didn't think Le'Veon Bell would hold out for the entirety of the 2018 season last year because I thought it was an objectively bad idea. It's not my body, it's not my choice. I'm not the one putting pads on every Sunday, I get it. I'm merely coming from the perspective of money optimization. And sitting out the 2018 season the way that I saw it last year, and honestly, the way that I still see it today, it didn't make a whole lot of sense for Le'Veon Bell. Now we've got another situation in fantasy football where a running back is threatening to hold out. Technically, we have two of them, but let's push the Ezekiel Elliott situation aside for now. Melvin Gordon wants a new contract, and that's going to cause headaches in fantasy football. So let me just brain vomit a little bit with what I know about the contract situation, or at least what I've read, and how I could see this playing out. And to be clear, I'm not a contract expert. I'm just some fantasy analyst and football fan sitting in his mom's basement who's curious as to how this situation could unfold. Specifically because Melvin Gordon matters a lot to the fantasy football landscape. But I read a good article on the subject from CBS Sports' Joel Corey, and he's a former agent, and I, among others, was able to ask him some questions on Twitter surrounding the Gordon situation. So first off, I think that we should get out of the way that this situation is not like Le'Veon Bell's last year. Remember, Le'Veon Bell was franchise tagged. He didn't sign that franchise tag, so he wasn't under contract. Melvin Gordon is currently under his fifth-year option. He was optioned because he was a first-round draft pick, something Le'Veon Bell was not. So Melvin Gordon can face penalties for not showing up because he's under contract. He can realistically be hit up to $30,000 a day when he's missing camp, which basically adds up to almost $1.5 million that he's foregoing if he were to hold out. So let's just pretend without any other circumstances attached to this situation, if Melvin Gordon just sits out the entire 2019 season, he's losing that money, but also the $5.6 million that he'd be making if he were playing. That still doesn't come all that close to the amount of money that Le'Veon Bell walked away from last year when he didn't sign the franchise tag, but it's still a good chunk of change. Now, you might have heard about accrued seasons and people talking about how it impacts Melvin Gordon and Ezekiel Elliott. Basically, a player needs to have had 4 accrued seasons in order to become an unrestricted free agent. And that's the case with Melvin Gordon. So we don't need to worry about him playing a certain number of games in order to accrue this 2019 season. What we do need to worry about is this 5th-year option and what that means. In paragraph 16 of the standard player contract, it states, "This paragraph tolls the contract if a player sits out a year. Thus, a player who has 1 year left under contract will not be a free agent the following year if he retires or refuses to play because of a dispute with the club." So essentially, if Melvin Gordon just simply sat out the entire year, then he'd be back in the same exact position in 2020 as he is right now. That right there is a lot of leverage on the Chargers' side. So the question becomes, how much time can Melvin Gordon wait until he absolutely has to play? Until tolling would come into play. And what Joel said on Twitter was, quote, "It's an open question on how much missed time triggers tolling. Joey Galloway missing the first 9 weeks in 1999 wasn't enough to trigger tolling. The safest thing is to stick to Galloway's timetable." So what that tells us is that Melvin Gordon could sit out about half the season before it would be completely logical for him to report. Because remember, if he doesn't play, he's in the same position next year as he is right now. So there is some ambiguity with this situation. We don't know the exact time frame for when Melvin Gordon would have to start participating. But what I gathered is actually not what I expected. Earlier this week, I thought the opportunity cost for Melvin Gordon sitting this year wasn't very significant. But it is because he's essentially just delaying the inevitable. Now the issue becomes, what the hell do you do with Melvin Gordon in fantasy football now? Well, given his stance and given the Chargers' current stance, which reports are saying that the two aren't close, it shouldn't surprise any of us if Gordon goes with an approach where he becomes active halfway through the season. The Joey Galloway approach. That way his contract isn't carried over into next season, but he's able to sit out enough to keep his legs fresh and not sustain an injury. It's very similar to how Le'Veon Bell was hypothetically handling last season. The difference is that Le'Veon Bell was becoming a free agent, or he was likely to. There's more on the line for Melvin Gordon from that perspective. So I would be surprised, unless I'm understanding this contract situation incorrectly, which is entirely possible, but I would be surprised if Melvin Gordon doesn't try to play at all this year. I'd be surprised if he sits out the entire season, because that would put him right where he is now. But if he still hasn't reported before your fantasy drafts happen, or if a contract hasn't been agreed to, I don't know how you can spend a first or second round pick on Melvin Gordon, because realistically, he could miss half the season. So I'm currently fading Gordon given the opportunity cost there, and I'm snagging Austin Eckler in those middle rounds and getting Justin Jackson late. Eckler has standalone value even with Melvin Gordon, but he'll likely get a bump if Gordon's out. And Justin Jackson has a chance to see a significant workload increase as well. He's actually someone that my prospect model liked a good bit, given his crazy college production. But that's my read on the situation, and it's a read that could easily change as I learn more about this stuff and as we learn more about Melvin Gordon's decisions. Like, they could come to an agreement tomorrow and none of this would matter. But going off of reports, that doesn't sound all that likely. But who knows? All I know is logic seems to tell us that Gordon would have to start participating eventually this year. We just don't know exactly when that would be. Before we get to the mailbag questions for this week, I wanted to send another reminder to check out NumberFire's draft kit. With the draft kit, you can get my overall and positional rankings, you can get projections and auction values from NumberFire's algorithm, and you can customize the draft kit to fit your league settings to make sure you're drafting a great team with NumberFire's analytics. So sign up for NumberFire Premium and start your journey to a fantasy football championship today. And while you're signing up, if you're a new user, use promo code CHAMPION to get your first month of premium for just $9.99. This first question is from @FF_downunder. Mike Clay and Evan Silva made pretty compelling arguments recently for Le'Veon Bell. Is he a safer pick than Melvin Gordon now? Yes, he's a safer pick than Melvin Gordon now. I don't have Melvin Gordon in my top 10 running backs anymore. Like I just mentioned, I don't think that you should draft him in the first 2 rounds. But Le'Veon Bell is in tier 3 for me at running back. I've got the big 4 of Ezekiel Elliott, Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, and Alvin Kamara in the first tier. David Johnson then comes in with his own tier. And then tier 3 has guys like Joe Mixon, Dalvin Cook, James Conner, and Le'Veon Bell. So he's a top 10 guy for me. I do like how the schedule is shaping up for the Jets and for them to potentially see some positive game scripts this year. But I do worry about Bell's overall situation, that offensive line, and the lack of plays that we could see run by that offense with Adam Gase running the show. So he's not my favorite in that third tier, but he's still pretty similar to the other guys that I mentioned. I think it's totally fine if you're into him this season. This next question is an email, and it says, JJ, can you talk about why or why not you have faith in Jared Cook this year at his ADP? I have painful visions of the last big-ticket free agent tight end to sign in New Orleans, Coby Fleener, and I remember being burned badly. Yeah, we all were. Cook has always struck me as an underperformer besides last year when the Oakland offense was in dire need of weapons. With a lot of playmakers in the fold in New Orleans, I'm not seeing Cook paying off. Am I wrong? Thanks. I don't think you're entirely wrong, but I don't think you're entirely right either. Let's look at why I don't think that this is a wrong take. The Saints are likely to be fairly run-heavy this season. So there's not a ton of volume to go around. It's crazy that we're saying that, but we now have evidence, a couple of seasons worth of evidence, showing us that they want to be run-heavy or that they are run-heavy. And they're able to do that because they're so efficient throwing the football. So volume is a toughish thing to come by in that offense. And then there's also regression. Drew Brees had a touchdown rate last year of 6.5%. His career average is 5.3%. He hadn't been over 5.5% in his 4 seasons prior to 2018. And the Saints are likely to regress as an offense too. I mentioned this in my team regression podcast about a month or two ago, but the New Orleans offense outperformed in the touchdown column based on their yardage total last year more than any other team in the league. They scored a touchdown on 38% of their drives. Of the 17 teams with touchdown rates around the 30% mark since 2011, that's way lower than the 38% mark that New Orleans had. But of those 17 teams, all of them declined in touchdown rate the following year. So that's definitely the negative side for Jared Cook. The positive side is that I disagree with you that there are a lot of playmakers in New Orleans. It's really just Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas demanding a large target share. I like Traquan Smith as a dart throw this year, and I like Latavius Murray in drafts as well. But let's just be real with what we're working with here. So I think a decent-sized target share can be carved out for Jared Cook, and that can mitigate a lot of the negatives. And given the tight end position isn't very obviously strong outside the top 10 or so, I understand why Jared Cook is being drafted where he's being drafted. I prefer Vance McDonald, but Cook isn't that overdrafted right now. This next question is from @RotoHeatSully. I've been working hard to defend my stance that Juju Smith-Schuster has wide receiver 1 overall upside. What say you? Thanks for all you do. Love the podcast. Thanks. Yeah, Juju absolutely has wide receiver 1 overall upside, but so do a lot of other wide receivers this year. You could make that case for DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Julio Jones, Odell Beckham, Michael Thomas, and even Mike Evans and maybe Antonio Brown to a degree. Those guys have that type of upside. But even though I love Juju, I've ranted about Juju on this podcast about how bizarre it is that people question his ability to be a number one wide receiver. But even though I love Juju, I've got to objectively recognize that someone like DeAndre Hopkins has been there, and he's insanely gifted. There are safer options than Juju to where you don't need to force him as your wide receiver one. So will I have Juju on my teams this year? Yes. Will I have him ranked as my wide receiver one? No. Is it crazy to think that he can finish as the league's wide receiver one? Not at all. This next question is an email. It says, "Hi JJ, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the always start your studs regardless of the matchup and game projection. It feels somewhat lazy. It's also unclear how many true studs there are at each position. Wouldn't DFS be a counter as to why the strategy could be misguided? Thanks, Alec." I don't think DFS would be a counter to that strategy because there's a cost associated with each player. In season-long fantasy, you're benching a stud for someone who's likely on your bench. And straight up in DFS, you'd likely take studs all the time because they're predictable. They're good. They're just very, very costly. But always start your studs isn't a bad philosophy because it's telling you that matchups can be overstated, which they can be. You want volume first and foremost, always. And studs give you that volume. Maybe some of you take it as start your stud because he's a big name and he's done it before. But if we get new information and the stud is no longer a stud, then I wouldn't just consider him a stud because he has a certain name. Last year, David Johnson's situation changed. He was no longer a stud. I recommended sitting David Johnson multiple times on this podcast last year because he was no longer a stud. So in that case, I guess I don't agree with the always start your studs idea. But if it's like DeAndre Hopkins or Ezekiel Elliott in a bad matchup, you're not sitting DeAndre Hopkins or Ezekiel Elliott. So it depends on the context here, I guess. This next question is from @JR Stats Don't Lie. Every year as training camp begins, there's a flood of information regarding every player. Some info is pertinent, while the rest is simply clickbait. How do you recommend going about separating the wheat from the chaff when it comes to training camp news? I tend to just remove anyone who's just saying things like, this guy looks really good, because that's subjective and it's not giving us anything that we can really work with. I'm more concerned with things like where guys are lining up, whether they're playing with the first team. And to be honest, I want to hear when there are negative things being said about players. We know there's going to be a lot of fluff, but when someone is saying bad things about players on their team, that's not a good sign. This next question is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, I try to pay attention to the narratives that are widely popular each fantasy year as I prepare for a draft. I am by no means a Giants fan or a Daniel Jones truther, but with that being said, as dumb as a pick as it was for the Giants to take Jones at 6, what is the best case scenario if Jones is competent and the offense is viable? This time last year, everyone was saying similar things about Josh Allen, and he turned out to be a viable fantasy quarterback. I'm not saying they are the same player, I just feel the narrative has formed into such certainty that I'm wary of overconfidence in this take. Thoughts? Thanks, Jeremy in Texas." Well, first off, I think we need to recognize that real football analysis doesn't always align with fantasy football analysis. Josh Allen worked out last year because he was scrambling a whole lot and gaining chunks of yards with his legs. He still only threw 10 touchdowns in 11 starts. He had very unsustainable production. So from that perspective, it's not like the narrative surrounding Allen was wrong. He wasn't a good passer last season. But I do think your email here is true at a higher level, and that's the idea of fading certain narratives. There's inherent variance with how we prospect and evaluate players. In other words, we're going to be wrong with how we view players. Now, with so many people not backing Daniel Jones, it likely means he's not going to be very good, because a lot of people are evaluating him and saying that he's not very good. But sure, he could be good. You have to accept that fact. Our evaluations before a dude plays a snap in the NFL are not certainties. How that impacts fantasy football in 2019, though, is that I don't think it does until we actually see it. I don't think there's any reason at all to buy into Daniel Jones when we don't even know if he's starting in week 1. And when the quarterback position is so deep, and when he's a rookie. So I don't think it's necessary at all to even be thinking about Daniel Jones as a standalone asset in fantasy football right now. I think you can consider the fact that the ceilings of the players in that offense might be higher with him under center. I don't think that's likely, but sure, that's part of the equation here. But if you're looking at this from a probability perspective, I just don't think it's worth overthinking the situation. Basically, there are other spots throughout the league that you can pinpoint and say, hey, look at the ceiling if X, Y, and Z happens that I think are much more likely than the Giants becoming this powerhouse offense in year 1 with Daniel Jones. Because a lot needs to break in order for that to happen. This next question is from Twitter from @ShowNuffKD. Who's the Bills running back to target? I'm not very bullish on any of the running backs in Buffalo this year. One of the four is likely to get cut, and it's not going to be Devin Singletary. And Singletary has the most question marks surrounding him as a player, but in a good way. The other guys are veterans, and we know that there's not a ton of upside. At least Singletary has that potential. So as much as it pains me to say this, because I wasn't a big fan of Singletary at all coming out, I guess he would be my choice. LaShawn McCoy is kind of interesting, though, because not only could he give you at least some flex appeal, but there's a chance that he gets cut. And I'm not predicting this to happen, but what if there's an Andy Reid reunion? I'm just saying. This next question is from @Tubaka. Who has the best combo of floor and ceiling in 2019? DJ Moore, Christian Kirk, or Chris Godwin? Yeah, so this is really just asking, how do you have these guys ranked? And currently I have them ranked Godwin, then Moore, then Kirk. But this is like asking someone to rank their children. I love all three of these receivers. I think all three are set to have big seasons, so target each one of them. This next question is an email. It says, "Hi JJ, there was a recent discussion on Twitter regarding adding flex spots to most leagues to diversify league formats and skill. I've been pounding the table for adding a single flex spot to our home league for years, but I can't get most owners to budge. We play in a 1 quarterback, 2 wide receiver, 2 running back, 1 tight end, 1 flex, 1 kicker format, which seems stale these days, 16 total roster spots. My league mates say that evaluating the weekly start-sit decision is the skill of fantasy, and adding a flex will ruin that. Whereas I view building and maintaining a roster through the course of the season the biggest skill of all, and the reason I suggest we add the flex spot is that so the strongest rosters are more likely to win out and reduce random score outbursts from an individual week. Curious to know your take on this topic and other words of advice that I can give my league mates to simplify the reasoning. I'm not quitting the league because these are my best, if not stalest friends. Thanks, JJ. You're the best. Mike from Kalamazoo." Thanks for the email, Mike. I mean, you're always going to have a start-sit decision. That doesn't go away with the addition of a flex spot. That decision is with lower-tiered players, sure. But let's not pretend that you no longer have to make tough choices because you have an additional spot in your lineup. Tell your league mates that they're playing scared. You should all be embracing more spots in your lineup because it's an added variable that helps the best teams in your fantasy league. This next question says, as the host of the official Aaron Jones podcast, what do you think is the likelihood that this is the season that he breaks out and becomes a top 5 running back? Rodgers has gushed over Jones and how the Packers need to feed him, but will LaFleur feed him like he did Henry at the end of 2018? I mean, I think that he's one of the players in that running back tier that he's in who has that upside. My biggest question mark around Jones in general is how the Packers will call plays at the goal line. They were second to last in the league last year in goal line rushes. They had as many as Arizona. In fact, since 2015, so over the last 4 seasons, Green Bay has the second fewest goal line rushes in the NFL. They've had the highest pass to rush attempt ratio in the entire league within the 5-yard line over this time. Maybe that was due to the old regime, but it could also be because of Aaron Rodgers and them having Aaron Rodgers. But yes, Aaron Jones has a lot of upside this year. You guys know that I'm a truther. My prospect model loved Aaron Jones coming out. And I do think the risk reward is there at his current ADP, so he's totally a fine draft pick. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And don't forget to leave a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.